CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to Global Business Europe, live from CGTN in London. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Juliette Mann. Our top stories. China launches the first module of its own space station in a major step in its exploration of the galaxies.
Our other headlines: Europe's biggest airline, Lufthansa, cuts its forecast for the year as hopes fade for an early summer rebound.
Stocks rally to record highs on President Biden's ambitious spending plans and America's economic rebound. We're live on Wall Street.
And another somber day in India and another global infection record as people scramble to get vaccinated. China has made another stride towards a permanent presence in space. The country has launched into orbit a key section of its own space station, which is set to be fully operational by the end of next year. Ning Hong reports.
It's a major breakthrough, with the Tianhe, Chinese for Heaven Harmony, core module brought into Earth orbit. China's space exploration has entered a new era.
I'm very proud to be part of the Tianhe mission. This is a great success for China.
The Tianhe core module is able to support 3 astronauts for 3 to 6 months. Upcoming missions to the module will include a cargo ship bearing supplies and a Shenzhou manned spacecraft, which will bring 3 astronauts up in June this year.
By the end of next year, in-orbit construction will be completed and the space station will begin operations. The designed life of the station in orbit is at least 10 years, but with regular maintenance carried out by astronauts and with regular replacements of equipment, the station's life can be extended for some time.
China's planning to complete the construction of its space station called the Tiangong, or Heaven Palace, with 11 intensive launches in 20 months. This will involve another 2 lab modules and 4 manned missions.
The successful launch of the core module of China's space station marks the beginning of the construction of China's space station. It also opens a new era as Chinese astronauts will be routinely going into space. Ning Hong, CGTN, Wenchang.
James Head is a professor of geological sciences at Brown University in the United States.
Well, it's really amazing. Tianhe is really the first module. It's the core module, of which there will be 2 additional modules, which will have scientific experiments. And the core module is where the crew will live, up 3 typically, maybe up to 5. And they will then do experiments, which will be focused in the other 2 modules, which will be launched in the coming year or 2. It's about a quarter the size of the International Space Station, and it's supposed to be completed by 2022, the 3 modules. So that's the schedule we're on, which is a very ambitious schedule, but I think, with the recent successes of Chang'e 5 and other Chinese space missions, landing on the far side of the moon, et cetera, I have no doubt that they're capable of meeting that deadline. So it's very, very exciting, and it's a wonderful addition to low Earth orbit space exploration and population, and essentially using space for peaceful purposes to explore for science.
Does China's space station link to Chang'e, the Chinese lunar exploration?
Well, everything you do to get into low Earth orbit, launch, rendezvous, docking, astronauts, transferring, et cetera, these are all things that are related to essentially how you go to the moon. We showed that 50 years ago in Apollo. And the United States did. And I think, each of these is, in fact, a big help in being able to send Chinese astronauts to the moon for exploration. And obviously, if you look at the logo for the Chinese Lunar Exploration Program, which is a robotic program, you'll see that, in fact, it's the symbol for, in fact, the moon, and it has 2 footprints in the middle. And it's clear that the Chinese lunar exploration program is the precursor, a scientific precursor for human exploration of the moon, just like we did in Apollo 50 years ago. So I'm really excited about this because there's so many unsolved problems on the moon, and we need all the help we can get internationally.
Look, the module is called in English Heavenly Harmony. So, with that in mind, what sort of international collaboration can we expect?
Well, this is a really good example. It's just like the International Space Station, in which the United States and Russia and many European nations and others are collaborating and cooperating on research in space. And this is it's a wonderful demonstration of soft, peaceful power. When you see what can be done with this huge rocket launching tons into space, and you really respect the United States, Russia, China for their abilities, and it's a peaceful way. You don't go, hey, let's go invade them or let's make trouble. No, this is soft power, peaceful power. And so from an international point of view, it not only is a demonstration, but also it's an opportunity. I mean, the bottom line is that both the US, Russia, China, they're all saying, hey, come join us in our activities in low Earth orbit. There's tons of science that can be done. Propose an experiment and we'll fly it. So, it's it's so much better in a peaceful sense than any confrontational aspects.
Well, Professor James had talked there about the experiments taking place. Can weightlessness stop cancer cells from growing? It's a question at the heart of a key experiment to be conducted on China's space station. The international project hopes to find breakthroughs in cancer therapies. Zhang Nini reports.
The successful launch of the Tianhe core module has brought a key space experiment one step closer for Dr. Tricia LaRose and her team.
Tumors in space is the most sophisticated cancer research experiment ever conducted in outer space. There is no cure for cancer, and we have done everything we can do on the ground to find a cure, and we have not been successful. So it's time then for us to look at other types of laboratories, and it's time to send tumors into space to see if we can find that cure.
The experiment will use human organoids, a 3D clump of human cells grown from the stem cells of a real tumor in a cancer patient. An organoid is by far the closest biosample to real human beings, therefore producing far more accurate results than two-dimensional cells used in previous studies. Dr. LaRose will test how cosmic radiation affects the DNA of healthy organoids and whether this leads to mutations in cancer.
If that's true, these mutational signatures act like fingerprints in our DNA. So we can then use that fingerprint to test astronauts, to test jet fighter pilots, to see if we can predict the risk, not just of cancer, but of any disease that's caused by cosmic radiation. So that's one of our hypotheses. Our second is to look to see if microgravity, so lack of gravity, can slow or stop the growth of cancer.
We know that the space environment provides unique microgravity conditions which cannot be replicated on Earth. So as such, how will you apply the findings to changing cancer therapies back here?
We can't send every cancer patient up into outer space so that their cancer will slow or stop growing. It's not feasible. But 20 years from now, maybe we can build an anti-gravity chamber on Earth. We're not doing this research for national interests. We're doing this research because cancer affects everyone in every country all around the world. So anything that comes out of this research is for the benefit of humanity.
The team has been working with China Manned Space Agency to make sure that the module that will serve as a space lab will be compatible. The experiment will be done in 2025, and the successful liftoff of Tianhe means that the plans for advanced space study of cancer cells are officially on track. Zhang Nini, CGTN, London.
Hopes are dwindling for a summer rebound for Europe's aviation sector, with new pandemic-related travel restrictions, virus variants and an initially sluggish vaccine rollout. Germany's Lufthansa managed to stem losses in the first quarter to $1.27 billion, mostly helped by deep cost-cutting. The group says it expects to operate at around 40% of its pre-pandemic capacity this year. London's Heathrow Airport has reported a $459 million loss in the first quarter and says it expects to handle between 13 and 36 million passengers this year. That's down from 81 million in 2019. But Airbus, the world's largest commercial aircraft manufacturer, posted a $439 million Q1 profit. With this caveat, the crisis is not yet over and the market remains uncertain. But all this as governments look to find ways of reopening travel, including vaccine passports and rapid testing. But many in the sector are concerned that the recovery will be hindered by quarantine requirements. Let's talk to our correspondent Ryan Thompson in Frankfurt, Lufthansa's main hub. So Ryan, let's start with the airline. They suffered a big financial hit in the first quarter, but what's the outlook for the rest of the year?
Hi there, Julia. Well, it's no secret. Quarter two will be rough for this airline. It is still very much a pandemic-era carrier, and it will have to carry on with the deep cost-cutting that will potentially mean layoffs. And unfortunately, in some cases, that looks like Lufthansa will be forced to make them forced layoffs in negotiations with some of these unions. But at the same time, in quarter two, bookings will increase, and that will bring optimism for Lufthansa and its airlines that are within the group. The recovery will be in the back half of the year. We will see the airline, though, be a very different airline. It will have to restructure. They said today it will be at about 40% of the capacity that it previously was. That will mean less perks, less flights. It will not look the same as the Lufthansa that you maybe knew before while you were passing over on a layover here in Frankfurt. And keep in mind that it was just about a year ago that this airline had to get help from the German government. So at the same time as they're managing these books, they're also paying off a €9 billion loan.
It's not just the airlines who are really feeling the pinch, is it? It's the airports themselves. Now, Frankfurt is one of Europe's busiest airports, so that you wouldn't know that looking up behind you today. But like Heathrow, it's been severely affected. Are there any signs of recovery?
Yeah, that's the thing, Juliet. It's still so quiet here. I couldn't believe my eyes every time we walked in here to do this story. Airports are hurting in Germany. If you remember, they actually were the subject of their own bailout, $1.1 billion in mid-January. And if you take a hub like Frankfurt, they are just not seeing the millions and millions of passengers that they previously did. They're seeing about 30% of the capacity that they were doing pre-pandemic, and that's on a good day. At the same time, these airports, like Frankfurt, are responsible for tons and millions of dollars in upkeep, airport security, air traffic controllers, cleaning and keeping the lights on. We're expecting the holding company of the Frankfurt airport, Fraport, to deliver their earnings report in about a week's time. But I can assure you, Juliet, it will probably look something like Heathrow's, and it won't be a very pretty financial picture.
Oh, dear. Ryan Thompson in Frankfurt. On that miserable note, we'll have to leave it there.
Well, let's talk to John Grant, who's director of the global travel data company OAG. John, good to see you. Are vaccine passports and rapid testing really the key to getting the international sector moving again?
Good afternoon. They absolutely are, but we're nowhere near where we expected to be in January or February of this year. And consequently, airlines and airports are going to suffer not just through the summer, but probably into the winter. It's a really serious situation we face at the moment.
When you talk to friends and family about the possibility of a holiday and then the possibility of having to quarantine at either end, I mean, that's the brutal reality of where we are, isn't it? I wonder how big an impact could those quarantine requirements have on holiday and travel?
Oh, absolutely. It's the number one issue. It's the complexity of travelling. It's the testing before you go. It's the digital passport. It's the quarantine when you get back. It's just so complicated and so time consuming that, people are frustrated and can't be bothered, quite frankly.
Just gaze into your crystal ball. How do you see recovery? Do you expect passengers to return rapidly? Everyone breathing a sigh of relief, this is over, let's all go on a long holiday? Or do you see this as a gradual return, perhaps in big numbers?
Well, I see a tsunami of demand, of pent-up demand that will travel very quickly. Because last year, in the same situation, we saw this short-term release from our homes and we were able to travel. And then suddenly from nowhere, restrictions were put in place. So people will take an opportunity to travel quickly. But I think very few people are going to be booking more than perhaps 4 or 5 weeks in advance because the fear of the unknown and the lockdown that may occur.
Zoom culture has proved that none of us really need to travel for business anymore. We all know about the prominence of the environmental agenda around the world and the economic difficulties after the pandemic. What do you believe will be the lasting impacts of the pandemic on the aviation sector?
The lasting impact is going to be a 5-year setback in terms of traffic growth. It's going to see the collapse of some airlines, a little bit of consolidation, and bizarrely, the emergence of some new airlines and some stronger carriers. This is an ideal opportunity for carriers like Ryanair, Wizz Air, and EasyJet to step in and really trample on the intra-European networks of the legacy carriers.
And we were in Frankfurt just a few moments ago. I mean, I wonder if airports like Frankfurt and Heathrow, which traditionally are long-haul hubs, aren't they? I mean, should they be seeking to move their business model to something else, something short-term?
I think they will come back. It's inevitable. Long-haul travel will recover. The airports are sometimes at the mercy of the airlines that operate there. So in the case of Heathrow, there is a huge dependency on long-haul traffic to North America and the United States. We would perhaps see some diversification of that from carriers like British Airways, who would like to de-risk some of their network in the future. But as always in aviation, you know, we don't have wings. It's the only way to get around the world.
John, good to talk to you. Thanks very much for coming on the programme. John Grant
Pleasure.
there from OAG.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, a bumper year for electric car sales. But are they really the magic bullet to stall climate change?
Search CGTN Europe wherever you get your podcasts to subscribe to the Agenda podcast. The Agenda with me, Stephen Cole, always gets to the heart of the story. Just subscribe today and listen now.
Covering the world from 4 continents. A new horizon. Teams in Beijing, Washington, D.C., Nairobi, and London. Who connect, interact, and inquire to bring you the stories that matter to all. The Link, only on CGTN. Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities. Reinvent. Find new opportunities. Discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. And remember, CGTN is available to watch for free on all of the major digital platforms, on Smart TV or online at Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire, Android TV, on YouTube, and Daily Motion, as well as CGTN.com and the CGTN app.
Global shares are trading higher after US President Joe Biden announced new spending plans, including a $1.8 trillion stimulus package.
In his first speech to Congress, Biden proposed tax rises on corporations and the wealthy to help pay for what he calls the American Families Plan.
I will not impose any tax increase on people making less than $400,000. But it's time for corporate America and the wealthiest 1% of Americans to just begin to pay their fair share. Just their fair share. I'm not looking to punish anybody, but I will not add a tax burden, additional tax burden to the middle class in this country. They're already paying enough. I believe what I propose is fair.
Let's talk to our correspondent, John Terrett in New York. Good to see you, John. And what do you make of Biden's speech?
Hey, Juliet. Hey, Juliet. Hey, Jamie. Well, it was very economic. You know, there was a lot of language in it. There wasn't much humanity, which surprised me because I was expecting that. And I was trying to think, why was that? And then it dawned on me why it was. Because they had no guests in the room. There's hardly anybody there. That's the thing. I mean, normally there's 1,600 to 2,000 people in the chamber of the House. And, of course, they couldn't get them in this time. So normally a president would turn to the balcony and say, you know, here's Mrs. So-and-so who's living on $4 a week, and we're going to help her and millions like her. And she will get a round of applause, but there wasn't any of that. So it was all very factual. And as predicted by me on the programme yesterday, he did indeed concentrate on education, family, infrastructure and jobs. And talking of jobs, we've just had the latest weekly jobless numbers out. 553,000 Americans signing up for first-time unemployment benefit as of last Saturday. It sounds like a lot, and indeed it is a lot. But at the same time, it's also the third week in a row that we've hit new lows. So I think that probably tells us something. And it's good that we're 900.
Oh, I think we might have lost John there. I'm just going to wait a moment to see if we can pull him back, but he might have disappeared into the ether. We'll be back with him a little bit later on.
He was so excited about President Biden's speech that I think...
And what he predicted.
Absolutely. He got it right as well.
All of it
That's
right.
what shocked him. Apple's profits have doubled since the start of the pandemic, fueled in part by surging iPhone sales in China. The company says consumers have been upgrading to those new 5G models and buying more computers and iPads, driven by a rise in working and studying from home. Revenues for the first quarter of 2021 were $89.6 billion. That is up 50% or more from the year before.
Facebook is also enjoying a bounce, with revenues hitting $26.17 billion in the first quarter. The US tech giant says the gains were mostly powered by higher ad spending. Facebook says it expects second quarter revenue growth to stabilise, but warned that third and fourth quarter growth rates could significantly decline.
Back in the black, oil prices are up, and so are the profits of Europe's major energy companies. BP and Total saw first quarter profits exceed pre-pandemic levels, while Shell saw an increase of 13% from the year 2020. Despite that good news, only Total's dividends reached pre-pandemic levels.
Baidu will launch its driverless taxi operation in Beijing next month. The Chinese tech giant is among the first companies in the country to offer the service. Baidu says its Apollo robo-taxi will operate without a safety driver. Users will be able to hail a ride and pay through an app.
The global auto industry suffered a punishing year in 2020 in the middle of the pandemic. But the electric car market bucked the trend, with sales up more than 40%.
That's according to the International Energy Agency, whose report into EV sales shows the momentum has continued into this year. Ross Cullen reports.
After a year of closed forecourts, slashed sales forecasts and go-slow signs for the traditional car market, electric vehicles provided a bright spot for the auto industry. The number of electric cars on the world's roads is now more than 10 million, with another roughly 1 million electric vans, heavy trucks and buses. But the world needs greater ambition. That's the call from the International Energy Agency, which wants to see this trend grow.
We will need much broader efforts across all parts of the energy sector. The technology solutions in heavy industries such as cement production, iron and steel production, and various others, in the building sector, in shipping and aviation, and of course for road vehicles, cars, trucks, buses, two-wheelers, and so on.
There was a more than 40% jump in electric vehicle sales last year, with a record 3 million new electric cars being registered in 2020. All this came as the global automobile market contracted 16% last year. The International Energy Agency is based here in Paris, one of the greenest cities in Europe. There's been a boom in bike use, electric scooters, and an increase in the number of parking and charging spots for clean cars. But some believe a shake-up of the entire business model is needed to meet environmental challenges. So instead of selling one car for use by one person, they'd like to see auto companies offering consumers a range of clean travel methods, including electric car sharing, autonomous driving, and incentives to cycle to work.
In the future, they will be selling mobility. Yeah? The idea that we want to possess our cars is from the 20th century. Yeah? Consumers nowadays want to have mobility. And that means that also for companies, it's an interesting thing to provide this integrative idea of mobility.
The impact of worldwide coronavirus lockdowns last year saw a fall in global air traffic, but a rise in electric vehicle sales. As the world starts to navigate a road out of the pandemic, there is hope here that clean transport can be a key driver of the energy landscape of the future. Ross Cullen, CGTN, Paris.
Let's explore this a little further with Jim Saker, the director of the Centre for Automotive Management at Loughborough University. Jim, good to see you. Big jump in EV sales then, but they're still a minority sport. I mean, just put some context on this for us. What's the current state of the global EV market? How many of us really are driving electric cars compared to the other motors?
It's still a small proportion by comparison to the globe, and also the fact that it's basically in certain countries, it's doing well in the UK, we're doing well in China, but it's very specific to those particular countries. So therefore, you're looking at those that have got infrastructure in place that can actually sustain the whole of the movement towards EV. So in reality, it's still a very small proportion, and you're looking at, and still the early adopters are in place. It's not mainstream by any means at the moment.
EV's critics will say that this is all greenwash, isn't it? The very act of manufacturing any vehicle, electric or otherwise, is inherently damaging to the environment, and they will go on to point out, no doubt, the problem of disposal of batteries. The environmentally responsible choice is not to buy a car at all, but to use public transport or walk or cycle. I mean, that's an agenda you don't often hear because we constantly listen to the EV narrative, don't we?
Yeah, the EV narrative is very persuasive, because it just appears as if you're reducing emissions. But if you take something like the Polestar 2, the electric car, that has got a 26-ton carbon footprint by comparison to a Volvo XC40, which is a standard SUV. And that means that to mitigate its carbon footprint against the Volvo, it has had to drive 49,700 miles to actually mitigate it, to bring it to an even position against a conventional XC40 vehicle. So you're looking at this and going, this is very, very much a distorted view of the world, in as much as it's focusing on certain countries, and it doesn't actually take into account the full production footprint and the carbon footprint of the electric vehicle.
And no one in the industry is making the case for perhaps new generation petrol or diesel. That's all dead to us now, isn't it?
Not totally. Most companies, if you look around the world, there's a lot of countries that don't have the the electric infrastructure to keep the lights on in hospitals and hotels. So they're not going to have charging points around the place to actually then facilitate that. So you're looking at most of the global companies are keeping some petrol, some diesel available for countries that just basically cannot sustain an EV network. And the obvious solution is obviously to move towards hydrogen. But, that's going to take place in, again, some countries. Japan, South Korea, India are looking very much towards a hydrogen-based economy.
Governments around the world, whether it be China, the United States, UK, Europe, want us all in electric cars, new electric cars, as soon as possible. But the fact is they're just too expensive for most of the world, aren't they?
Oh, yeah, they're an expensive technology, and the growth has been based historically very much on government subsidies. People want to have an electric vehicle. If they want an electric vehicle, they would like a subsidy to it. Because obviously you have to then say, well, what is the convenience factor about charging? It's fine if you've got a house where you can charge overnight, but if you haven't got the charging infrastructure in place, it's an inconvenience. And so therefore you have range anxiety and a whole range of different factors that come into the purchasing of an electric vehicle and the reasons why people wouldn't purchase it.
Jim Saker at Loughborough University, thank you very much indeed for coming on the programme.
Okay.
Well, let's get back to financial markets. As you heard earlier, global shares are trading higher after US President Joe Biden announced new spending plans, including a $1.8 trillion stimulus package. I'm delighted to say that we've got John Terrett, our correspondent in New York, back. Good to see you. John, you were telling us about the highlights of Biden's speech that you had correctly predicted were coming.
Yeah, I heard you commenting on my ability to predict these things, because although the picture disappeared, I could still hear every word that you and Jamie were saying. And my disappearance, this is down to Jamie not putting 50p in the meter before the programme again. I know, you must get him to put the 50p in, otherwise it happens. Look, let me just quickly sum up what Biden said. It was a very economic speech. Basically, it was on jobs, infrastructure, family and education. He appealed for bipartisanism, that's Republicans and Democrats working together, especially on the American Family Plan, $1.8 trillion. That's new. The infrastructure plan recently announced $2 trillion. It's his view of how he wants to transform America. And there was no drama, there were no insults. At one point he actually praised the Republicans, saying that he liked the fact that they put forward their own infrastructure plan and he was prepared to work at it. He also said no one in America should work for 40 hours a week and get less than $15, in other words, live under the poverty line. And he's referring to the federal minimum wage there. There are some citizen states that do pay $15. He also touched on police reform, mentioning George Floyd by name, and immigration as well, although didn't seem to do as much on immigration as I thought he would. Juliette.
Well, no insults, you say, but Biden took aim at China in his speech.
Well, yeah, that's a good point. Then there was foreign affairs, wasn't there? Yes, there were a few insults hurled around there. Kind of, sort of, anyway. You know, it's what politicians do, I'm afraid. They have to get headlines. He singled out China. This is happening because Americans are being told on radio and television and the newspapers that China is the biggest threat right now to them against their way of life. And Biden said that he intended to keep up a very strong U.S. military presence in the Indo-Pacific. He tends to boost trade in the region and elsewhere. That's U.S. trade. They're doing that anyway through the Strategic Competition Act, which is in the Senate at the moment. He came up with a great line. He said there's no reason why wind turbine blades can't be built in Pittsburgh instead of Beijing. That is a great line. Whoever wrote that should get a big tick from the teacher over at the White House. He got a big clap as well. And he said that the U.S. would stand up to practices that it considers undercut American workers being pursued by Beijing. Well, this is all, this is what politicians say. They have to appease the audience watching at home. Nonetheless, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Beijing had something to say about all of that, and this is exactly what they did say.
It is normal for China and the United States to compete in some areas, but this kind of competition should not be a life and death duel. The two sides should improve themselves through competition rather than engage in vicious competition and zero-sum games.
Isn't it funny? Both sides basically say the same thing about the other. What that man said is essentially more or less what Biden said sort of 13, 14 hours ago. It does appear as if Joe Biden is being tougher on China than we thought he was going to be. And the best example of that is the companies here delisted at the stock exchange have not been reinstated. There are Chinese corporations that Americans are now banned from doing business with. This was all started under Trump, but Biden has done nothing to reverse it. As I say, I think it's a lot of heat and light, really. They're looking for headlines in the Washington Post and on cable television, and they certainly got that. And I think you have to remember that the two sides cooperate all the time on trade behind the scenes. And they're also cooperating, and we had that pledge last week from both sides at the climate summit to work together on climate. So that's going to bring them together in the future, much more than they will likely be apart. Joe Biden is now arriving in Atlanta, the huge city in Georgia in the south of the country. He's going there to begin selling these policies now to the American people. Tomorrow, Friday, he'll be in Philadelphia. The White House calls it the Back on Track tour. Juliet.
Oh, John, it wouldn't be Global Business Europe without you. Thanks ever so much.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, a country in crisis. Indians desperately try to get vaccinated as the country's healthcare system reaches the brink of collapse.
More than 100,000 people in Italy have now died from COVID-19.
The vaccination program offers some hope for the future, but intensive care units are near capacity.
The Spanish government is hoping to vaccinate over 1 million people by next month.
Living in Germany are struggling with their mental health.
Hungary is supplementing the EU's vaccine rollout, buying doses from Russia and China to speed up the process.
4 million people have tested positive in France.
After a grim winter, the promise of a spring bloom that could mean freedom for millions.
On the agenda with me, Stephen Cole, we look up into space. We look down into data. We look at debt. We look at politics. We look at opioids, climate change. We look at all the issues that really matter around the world. But you matter too. We want to tell the stories you want to see and hear about. Make it your agenda.
We can try out the wild and crazy ideas.
Nothing can stop an idea whose time is coming. This idea is coming.
I actually feel quite comfortable in isolation.
We should all be very basic when we're trying to save the world.
Oh, no.
We hope it will happen. We have to live in hope.
The agreement is signed. But what is the real deal now the UK has left the EU? For trade, for business, for the city, for ordinary people. Make sense of Brexit with CGTN. Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Juliet Mann. Our top stories. China has successfully launched the first module of its own space station in a major step towards a permanent space presence.
Europe's biggest airline, Lufthansa, has cut its forecast for the year as hopes fade for an early summer rebound.
And stocks have rallied to record highs on President Biden's ambitious spending plans and America's economic rebound.
India's coronavirus crisis is deepening. In the past 24 hours, the country has recorded another world record number of daily infections, nearly 380,000 cases.
India's healthcare system is on the brink of collapse, with hospitals and graveyards overwhelmed. Ravinder Bauer reports now from Delhi.
Well, international aid has started pouring in from various parts of the world. The government has stated that more than 40 countries are actually sending in donation in the form of oxygen concentrators, ventilators, liquid oxygen, even medicines are arriving, which will then be distributed to different states, and the whole operation will be taken care of by a task force which has been formed, which is an inter-ministerial team, and all these ministries will be coordinating coordinating with the states, and then these equipments will be sent to the state which requires it the most, knowing that Delhi is facing a massive shortage of oxygen, because of which we are seeing a number of people lose their lives. Delhi will also be taking claim in terms of getting more oxygen plants which are coming in from different parts of the world. So all that is happening on the one hand, and on the other hand, the vaccination program, the fourth phase has taken off. More than 10 million people have registered for the fourth phase, which means people who are above the age of 18 will get vaccinated from 1st of May. But interestingly, none of these people have got an appointment while they were registering, which was not the case earlier. That means they have not been given a specific date for the jab, and that clearly shows that there is shortage of vaccination. And apart from that, we've also seen a lot of information that is coming from the ground, that people who have gone for second dose have not received it because the vaccination centers have a display board saying no vaccine doses are available. So there is a massive shortage of vaccination as well, for which India is coordinating with other countries and trying to get some vaccinations also as a part of vaccine doses as a part of the donation. But all this is only showing one thing, that the country was not prepared for the second wave, and on the other hand, the systems have really crushed, and now it will take a bit of a time before things can be streamlined, or maybe more lives will be lost in the process.
Ravinder Bauer reporting from Delhi. Turkey has launched a lockdown to curb a surge in coronavirus. People will have to stay home except for essential shopping and urgent medical treatment. Schools are also closed, while travel restrictions are in place until the 17th of May. Meanwhile, Portugal's national state of emergency is set to end on Friday as cases and deaths continue to fall there. The government began easing lockdown restrictions around 6 weeks ago and says the country is on track for further opening up next week.
They are allies in the battle against coronavirus. China's President Xi Jinping and Hungarian leader Viktor Orban have been talking about their efforts to bring the pandemic under control. Now, Hungary has the highest vaccination rate in the European Union, thanks in part to China. The Hungarian government decided to use Chinese and Russian vaccines in its rollout without waiting for EU approval. Well, Penelope Lush is in Budapest. Penelope, good to see you. Why is an EU country reliant on China and Russia for vaccines?
Well, Juliet, it's really the cornerstone of the whole vaccination program here in Hungary. The Orban government decided very early on, as you said, to go for these vaccines from Russia and China before they were approved by the EU. 5 million Sinopharm doses were ordered from China, and they've steadily been arriving. More than 1.7 million have currently touched down in the country. Hundreds of thousands come in most weeks, and that's something government officials are very clear on preaching about on social media, making sure that people know these doses have arrived on time ahead of scheduled doses of vaccines from the EU. So they really are reliant on these vaccines to keep the vaccination program running, and so far it's kept them right at the top of the number of coronavirus vaccinations per capita within the European Union.
So they talked about vaccines. What else was discussed?
Well, one of the major things that was up for discussion is the cooperation between China and Hungary. Both sides have noted that that's very important for ongoing cooperation between China and then Central and other European nations. So that was really something that was a positive that both sides touched on, that they're keen to continue and support. Another many major projects within Hungary are currently also funded by Chinese government investment at the moment. And Viktor Orban made it very clear he'd like to see more Chinese enterprises investing here. He said he promises a good business environment. We've seen a lot of investment, particularly in the rail sector, to help train freight arrive from China into Hungary. And he's also been noted throughout this meeting that both sides will continue to really actively promote the Hungarian-Serbian rail line. Now, that's also got a significant Chinese investment behind it.
Penelope, while you're there, can you give us an update on where things are in Hungary in terms of COVID and lockdown easing?
Well, especially if you listen to what the government has been saying, things are going quite well in Hungary, particularly compared to other parts of the European Union. As we were talking about before, the vaccine program has rolled out quite quickly. They've had plenty of vaccines to use. They have enough at the moment to vaccinate every person who has registered. Nearly 40% of the country has had at least one dose of vaccine. We're waiting for the 4 million mark to be reached. It's likely to be announced that that happens tomorrow. And from there, there'll be a reopening of large parts of the economy. Already outdoor dining is open, but once that 4 million mark is reached, gyms, swimming pools, theatres, cinemas, indoor dining, those things will all be back and available for people who can prove they've had a vaccination certificate. The numbers, while the deaths are sometimes still remaining quite high and struggling to fall, we are seeing most days that the infection numbers are falling along with hospitalisations, so that has to be good news.
It is good news. Penelope Lesh, thank you very much.
Alexei Navalny has made his first appearance since ending his hunger strike. The jailed Kremlin critic appeared in a Moscow court via video link from prison. He was appealing against his conviction for defamation against a World War II veteran. He criticised Russia's justice system and President Putin, but his conviction was upheld, with new charges added.
Police in Germany have detained a hospital employee after 4 people were found dead at a clinic near Berlin. Authorities have opened a murder inquiry and say the victims' injuries were the result of violence. Local media says they were patients and had been attacked with a knife.
Indonesia's president has met relatives of the 53 people who died on board a military submarine that sank off the coast of Bali last week. Joko Widodo said his government would build homes for the bereaved families and fund their children's education. The authorities are currently trying to retrieve the bodies.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. Boris Johnson's critics say he's painted himself into a corner on explaining who paid for his home renovations.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there. To see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you. All around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
Mari, what would you say is a good question?
Stephen, I'd say it's one where there's always more than one answer.
The Answers Project is a new podcast series from CGTN Europe. With me, Stephen Cole.
And me, Mari Beveridge. In each episode, we'll take a complex question.
And with the help of some of the world's foremost experts, shine light on some of the answers. So join us for The Answers Project.
Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. The pressure continues to mount on UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson to explain who paid for the refurbishment of his apartment.
Downing Street has appointed an advisor for ministerial conduct, but the opposition says that allows Boris Johnson to mark his own homework. Guy Henderson explains.
There are local elections approaching in the UK at the moment, and this is what the British government wants to talk about in the build-up. It's so far very successful rollout of coronavirus vaccinations. Here are pictures filmed on Thursday of the UK Health Minister, Matt Hancock, receiving his own first dose, seemingly in good spirits. That is not what is dominating the front pages of the newspapers on Thursday, though. Instead, it is they are focusing on a growing sleaze scandal over whether Prime Minister Boris Johnson may have broken the ministerial code of conduct. Amid allegations he asked a Conservative Party donor to pay for the refurbishment of his Downing Street apartment and then failed to report that matter correctly. Downing Street insists the Prime Minister covered the costs himself, but won't clarify who paid initially and why all this was reported months late. The Electoral Commission suspects an offence may have occurred and is opening an investigation. This is what the Prime Minister had to say about that probe.
Of course we will, as I said yesterday in the Commons, where, to be frank, we gave this issue a pretty good run around the park. We will comply with whatever they want, and I don't think there's anything to see here or to worry about.
Now a second investigation will be overseen by a newly appointed advisor to the government, Lord Geit. And it is this investigation that the main opposition Labour Party are now turning their focus towards, after Prime Minister Johnson said that ultimately it would be him having the final say on any investigation into ministerial misconduct. Well, what the opposition say is that that would be akin to giving the Prime Minister the right to mark his own homework, essentially, and they fear that this kind of investigation would simply end up being a whitewash. So Johnson clearly is trying to move on from this story now. In election season, though, the opposition are trying to make sure that doesn't happen. Guy Henderson, CGTN, London.
University students across the UK are taking their exams, but some will finish their studies having never physically attended a class. A wave of infections last autumn saw many switch to online learning.
Quality of teaching has suffered, while students say they've paid out on unnecessary and expensive accommodation. John Beaver reports.
For the past year, this has been a very rare sight. Rather than attend classes in person, the majority of students have had to make do with online learning. Among them is Ben Block. His entire year-long master's course has been virtual. He understands why, but he's not happy.
There are serious issues that the government needs to address that haven't addressed, that are being raised and have been raised by students up and down the country for over a year at this point. There are things such as fees that we're paying, such as the fact that we're on lockdown, we can't learn on campus, and yet we're still paying for accommodation. The government told us we would be getting in-person learning. Universities sold, a mix of in-person and online learning. Students came, signed tenancy agreements, and are paying thousands of pounds, and yet we're not getting the on-campus experience at all.
Many universities are playing it safe, even though government guidance means they should be allowed this year. The graduation ceremonies that would normally take place here at Bristol Cathedral in July have already been postponed until spring 2022. For teaching, all courses should be face-to-face by May, but for many, that's after their studies finish.
Campuses have hairdressers, they have bars, etc. They can now open, and the students could technically visit them. So they can go and visit the hairdresser on campus, but they can't, or the barbers, and they can't attend a tutorial, which would by its very nature be a small group.
The government and universities are unmoved. The health of students and staff, they say, is paramount. The plans for some in-person learning were dropped as coronavirus cases rose. But Bristol, like other major university cities in the UK, is full of international students who, in retrospect, could have done their studies from anywhere in the world. It means that many students have paid thousands for accommodation that they didn't actually need. Bristol University have said that despite the challenging circumstances, they remain committed to delivering the same high-quality learning outcomes for their students this year. A return to in-person learning should be possible for students everywhere in the coming weeks, so long as infection rates remain low. John Beaver, CGTN, Bristol.
Well, let's return to that milestone in China's space program, the launch of a key section of its own space station. So what does the module look like? Here's Yo Yang.
At the main control cabin of China's first space station, the core module of Tianhe is about 16.6 meters long with a diameter of over 4 meters. is divided into 3 parts: the connector, the life support and the control section, as well as the section for resources. The connector looks like a hexagon. It has 2 base ports for 2 lab modules called Wentian and Mengtian, and 3 docking ports for the Shenzhou crew spacecraft, the cargo and other vehicles. It also has an exit on top where astronauts can conduct spacewalks. This is the living area of the crew. It's about 50 cubic meters. It's also called the thinner area. It's got 3 sleeping areas and 1 sanitary part. This is the thicker part, which is the working area, where astronauts control the daily operation of Space Center while conducting some scientific experiments. If we take a look from the outside, this is the resources part of Tianhe. It's responsible for fueling the space station. Once operational, the space station can host 3 astronauts for 6 months and up to 6 astronauts by replacement. Yu Yang, CGTN, Beijing.
Well, China's space station may be the newest, but of course it's not the first to orbit the planet. The International Space Station was launched before the millennium and has had humans living on board for more than 20 years.
The International Space Station is the largest single structure humans have ever put into space. Its components were constructed and assembled between 1998 and 2011. In 1993, the United States and Russia agreed to merge their separate space station plans into a single facility, with assistance and components from a multinational consortium including Canada, Japan, and 11 member states of the European Space Agency. The first component of the International Space Station was launched on a Russian rocket in 1998. More pieces were added after that, and 2 years later, the station was ready to host astronauts. The first crew arrived on November 2, 2000, and humans have been staying there ever since. The space station flies at an average altitude of 400 kilometers above Earth. In one day, the ISS travels about the distance it would take to go from Earth to the Moon and back. The space station is as big inside as a house with 5 bedrooms. It has 2 bathrooms, a gymnasium, and a big bay window. It weighs 391,000 kilograms and is big enough to cover an American football field, including the end zones. It also has science labs from the United States, Russia, Japan, and Europe. The International Space Station is making discoveries not possible on Earth and helping us push further into space.
Every single day, we are answering big questions about Earth and about space, about where we came from and about where we're going. But the other thing that we're doing is we're learning more questions to ask.
The Alpha Magnetic Spectrometer 02 has been looking for evidence of dark matter from outside of the space station since 2011. The 1-year mission conducted between 2015 and 2016 was the first of a series of extended duration research missions to develop a better understanding of how each human system adapts to the spaceflight environment. In 2018, NASA's Cold Atom Lab became the first facility to produce the 5th state of matter, called a Bose-Einstein condensate, in Earth's orbit. The space station is a home in orbit. People have lived there since the year 2000. Current plans call for the space station to be operated through at least 2024, with the partners discussing a possible extension until 2028. After that, plans for the space station are not clearly laid out. It could be deorbited or recycled for future space stations in orbit. But humans will not stop exploring the unknown and the endless universe.
Back on planet Earth, a different kind of launch, and don't try this one at home. A Yorkshire airfield was the setting for pro golfer Marcus Armitage to set a new world record for landing a golf ball in a moving car. He managed 277 metres, beating the previous record by 27 metres. And yes, the club he used was a driver.
The headlines again. China has launched the first module of its own space station, a major step forward in its exploration of the galaxies.
And stocks have rallied to record highs on President Biden's ambitious spending plans and America's economic rebound. Well, that's it for Global Business Europe. Thanks for watching.
More on all of our stories at europe.cgtn.com. We're on apps such as Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, on YouTube and Dailymotion, as well as cgtn.com and the CGTN app.
From all of the team here in London, goodbye.
Goodbye.